Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're heading into one of the oldest chapters of human storytelling, the strange and fascinating tale of the Anunnaki. If you've never heard of them, the Anunnaki were a group of gods first mentioned in the cuneiform tablets of Mesopotamia more than 4,000 years ago. They appear in creation myths, epic poetry, and royal inscriptions, and in many ways they were the backbone of Sumerian and Akkadian religion. What makes the Anunnaki especially interesting is how they have been reinterpreted again and again. The Babylonians made them the companions of gods like Marduk and Ishtar. Later, Assyrian texts gave them other duties. And in recent decades, they've been adopted into modern theories about lost civilizations and even visitors from the stars. From clay tablets to conspiracy books, the Anunnaki have traveled an extraordinary distance. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're settling down for sleep or just curious about how myths can travel through time, I'm glad you're here. Now, let's begin. If you want to picture the beginning of cities, do not start with marble columns or tidy avenues. Imagine a wide, flat plain at the lower end of the Tigris and Euphrates, a land of glistening mud and restless water that today lies mostly in southern Iraq. Each spring the rivers swelled, split into shifting channels, and left behind silt that could grow grain in improbable abundance. The floods were unpredictable. One year they failed, another year they ruined fields. To survive, people learned to coax water through ditches and embankments. Out of that practical struggle with mud and time came something new in human history. Villages that had once been little clusters of reed huts became towns with canals, storehouses, shrines, and busy quays. A few of those towns became true cities. We call that place Sumer. Archaeologists give names to the eras of Sumer as if they were chapters in a patient book. The Ubaid period brought early temples, painted pottery, and the first organized irrigation. The Uruk period followed, beginning roughly in the 4th millennium before the Common Era, and with it, the first city that we can actually picture in detail. Uruk grew into a metropolis by ancient standards, perhaps home to tens of thousands of people, which is astonishing when you think that a few centuries earlier their ancestors still hunted wild pig and collected reeds on the marsh edge. Uruk had districts, monumental platforms, and temple compounds. It had workshops for potters, metalworkers, and weavers. It had administrators with a talent for counting other people's grain. Uruk's skyline, if you can call it that, rose in tiers of brick. There was a sacred precinct dedicated to Inanna, mistress of love, war, and civic pride, and another to An, the sky god whose name would echo through the centuries. On one high platform stood a whitewashed temple that caught the sun for miles across the plain. Citizens climbed processional stairways with offerings of barley, beer, and dates. Priests tended fires and wrote on wet clay. The city sounded like 1,000 small industries running at once. Kilns roared, millstones rasped, goats bleated in lanes shaded by date palms. At the quays, barges from upriver unloaded timber and stone that the alluvial plain could not provide for itself. This is where writing begins to look like writing. For generations, people had marked tallies on clay tokens shaped like cones and spheres. Then, in Uruk, officials pressed signs into clay tablets with sharpened reeds. At first, these were simple records of rations and deliveries. Then came signs for names, places, and actions. Those wedge marks are what we now call cuneiform. It started as a ledger and evolved into literature, law, and myth. In the space of a few centuries, scribes went from listing sheep to recording hymns and royal deeds. One day, someone drew the first map on clay and made a small miracle that no one noticed at the time. The Sumerians organized their world around the city temple. The temple owned fields, canals, herds, and workshops. It rationed beer to workers and held the keys to the granary. To move water and marshal labor, people needed hierarchy. Titles emerged. An Ensi was a city governor, a steward of the god. A Lugal was a king, literally a big man, who stood for the city in war and treaty. He was not a god, but he could speak to the gods on behalf of the people. Councils met in courtyards and decided everything from canal clearing to boundary disputes. When you read the tablets, you can hear the civic rhythm. Send so many men to dredge this reach of the canal. Deliver so many baskets of barley to the temple brewery. Repair the quay before the date harvest. Other cities rose along the rivers. Nippur became the spiritual hub where the great gods convened and where kings sought divine approval for their rule. Eridu, far to the south on the old Gulf shore, boasted a sacred lineage that Sumerians called the oldest in the land. Flourished near the river mouth and would later build a ziggurat so grand that it would still impress travelers 2,000 years on. Lagash grew powerful and wrote about land surveys and legal reforms under a ruler named Urukagina who, in a burst of civic grit, tried to protect widows and curb the graft of officials. Kish watched the northern approaches and appears again and again in early royal lists, which suggests it had the swagger of a gatekeeper. Sumer had few trees, little stone, and no copper in the ground. Yet its people wanted all three. So they traded. Boats slipped down canals into the river and out to the Gulf, then on to Dilmun, which most scholars place in Bahrain and the eastern Arabian coast. There they acquired copper from the land they called Magan, probably Oman, and shipped it home as ingots. They coveted lapis lazuli, a blue stone that came from far beyond Elam and the Zagros, likely from Afghanistan through long chains of exchange. Cedar came from the mountains of the Levant and the Taurus. In return, Sumer sent out woolen textiles, processed foods, and crafted goods. A potter in Uruk could turn clay into trade goods that paid for copper tools used to dig the canals that watered the fields that fed the potter. It was the first compounding of an economy on record. Agriculture drove everything. The soil was generous but tricky. Without careful watering, it dried into a tough crust. With too much watering and poor drainage, it accumulated salt that stunted barley. The Sumerians learned to rotate crops, flush fields, and cut new channels when old ones clogged. They measured time for work in the sexagesimal system, a base 60 way of counting that still gives us 60 minutes in the hour and 360 degrees in a circle. They assembled lists of professions and plants in tablet after tablet. There were words for different types of canal, different grades of beer, different kinds of reeds for mats and ropes. It is the vocabulary of a people who learned that survival depends on knowing how to name what you use. Religion was not set apart from this daily grind. It saturated it. Each city placed a patron deity at the center of its identity. Inanna stood for Uruk. Enki, the clever lord of waters, presided at Eridu. Nanna, the moon god, watched over Enlil, the force of air and authority, had his great temple at Nippur, where kings came to receive the token of rule. People did not visit shrines out of habit alone. They believed the gods fed on offerings, guided omens, and decided which projects would thrive. Festivals brought whole populations into the streets to sing, carry statues, and mark the turning of seasons. When a canal held, when a harvest exceeded expectation, when a caravan returned intact, the credit went first to the gods. In these early centuries, we see the first outlines of the divine family, that the Sumerians called the princely seed, the offspring of the sky. The specific rosters would vary from city to city and from century to century. But the idea was simple. The world is not random. It is organized under a council of powerful beings who assign roles to gods and tasks to humans. That council is what later texts will call the Anunnaki. At this stage, the name functions as a label for the high gods of the pantheon more than a fixed list. What matters is the sense of order. The temple administrators divided fields and water rights. The divine assembly, imagined on a grander plane, divided realms and destinies. Sumerian art captures this order with charming directness. Cylinder seals carved in fine detail show processions of worshippers, banquets, musicians, ploughmen, and officials receiving a rod and ring from a seated deity. Reliefs show horned crowns and flowing beards that mark divine status. The gods look like majestic versions of humans because the people who made them were trying to think with familiar forms. A god of the sun holds a saw-toothed symbol of justice because sunlight reveals what is hidden. A god of the river pours water from a jar because that is what rivers look like in a world made of clay and canals. Law and memory grew out of this complex life. The earliest surviving law codes from later in the tradition would appear at and elsewhere, but their spirit already shows in the administrative tablets of the Uruk and early dynastic periods. Contracts record loans repaid in barley. Oaths invoke deities to guarantee honest weights. Land transfers describe precise field edges with reference to canals and boundary stones. You can feel a society learning to trust the written word as much as the spoken one, which is a quiet revolution of its own. War was an unwanted but recurring part of the story. Cities quarreled over water and territory. Armies marched along canal banks. Troops pulled battle wagons with solid wooden wheels. Fortified walls rose around cities and sent their brick weight into the horizon. Victory steles recorded outcomes with blunt clarity. In one famous fragment from later centuries, a king of Lagash boasts of reclaiming a border ditch and erecting a stone that lists field distances with a surveyor's care. The concerns are mundane and yet foundational. Who controls the head of a canal controls the life of thousands. What, then, made Sumer the cradle of civilization in more than name? Cities and writing, yes, but also the idea that human effort and divine favor together could make a precarious land livable. The Sumerians took a marshy delta and turned it into a network of fields and towns that fed artisans and scribes, priests and merchants. They learned to turn grain into beer and surplus into trade. They built into brick the belief that the universe has an order and that cities can mirror it if they organize themselves well. Out of this matrix, the stories of the gods took on particular shapes. People looked up from their ledgers and their canals and asked who set the rules of the world in the first place. The Sumerians began their story at the widest possible scale. Before people dug the first canal, before a scribe pressed a sign into wet clay, there was a single mass of sky and earth. They called the sky An. They called the earth Ki. Imagine an unbroken hole that needed to be parted so that space could open for life. That division is the first act in their cosmic history. From An and Ki came a family of gods. Their name for this clan was the Anunnaki, which means the princely seed or the offspring of An. In other words, these were not distant spirits. They were a royal household born from the union of sky and earth. The Sumerians pictured them as a council. They met, argued, and reached decisions that set the pattern of the world. When a king took the throne, when a river changed course, when a city flourished, it was because the great gods had decreed it. At the center stood Enlil. He was the force of air and authority. Sumerian poems say that he separated heaven and earth. He took the earth for his own realm, while his father An kept the sky. This was not a violent battle in the way later myths would imagine such scenes. It was an act that created order. From that moment, the world had layers. The high dome where An presides. The middle ground where Enlil rules over fields, cities, wind, and storm. The deep waters beneath, which belong to a different power entirely. That power is Enki. In Akkadian texts, he is called Ea. He is lord of fresh water, wisdom, and craft. His home is Eridu, a city that Sumerians claimed as the oldest seat of worship. They imagined his temple standing near the edge of marsh and sea, where sweet water and salt water meet. Enki appears again and again as the god who solves problems. He shapes plans, assigns functions, and looks for clever ways to keep the system running when others have made a mess of it. Ninhursag belongs with them at the start. She is the great lady of the sacred mountain, a mother figure who presides over birth, growth, and the vitality of the land. In some traditions, she is the very key of the first generation seen under a personal name. In others, she is a distinct mother goddess who works with Enki when life needs a maker. When Sumerians speak of shaping humankind from clay, they often place Ninhursag at the side of the creator, steady and capable. Around these leading figures stand other children of the sky. Nanna, also called Sin in Akkadian, is the moon god whose shining bark crosses the night. His great temple rose at and its priests timed the months by his waxing and waning light. Utu, called Shamash later on, is the sun and the judge who sees all. His cult center at Sippar and Lhasa connected justice with daily light. Inanna, called Ishtar in later texts, embodies love, passion, and the sharp edges of war. Her temple district at Uruk was famous for wealth, song, and pageant. Each of these deities belongs to the high family. Each carries a domain that mirrors something essential in daily Sumerian life. If you look at how the stories work, you see a careful design. The divine family is both a map of nature and a model of government, and sits above as a figurehead who rarely acts. Enlil governs the middle world with force and decree. Enki advises and invents, easing conflicts with wit and craft. Ninhursag gives form and endurance. The younger gods execute tasks that match their natures. Utu brings justice because sunlight reveals and clarifies. Nanna marks time because the moon is a clock you can trust with your eyes. Inanna animates human bonds and human violence because both belong to the heat of life. The pantheon is not a list, it is a working chart. The word Anunnaki does not fix a single roster. In one composition you may see 7 named as the most senior. In another you meet a wider assembly called by the same title. What remains steady is the idea that these are the great gods, the high court that assigns destinies. When a text says the Anunnaki sat, it means that the great powers gathered and reached a binding decision. The Sumerians imagined this council at Nippur, Enlil's holy city, where kings came to seek tokens of legitimate rule. In ritual terms, a ruler became real when the cosmic bureaucracy said yes. Art supports this picture. The horned crown marks a god. The rod and ring in a divine hand mark the gift of measured authority. Cylinder seals show the seated deity conferring signs of rule on a human official, who approaches with a clean hand and gaze averted. In these scenes, you can see the same social grammar that runs through temple accounts and boundary stones. The cosmos is orderly. Rank matters. Powers are delegated. Duties are assigned to fit the task and the season. Poems and hymns often list the me, a term that we can translate as the divine ordinances of culture and nature. They are the attributes and functions that make civilization run. Temple building, kingship, music, weaving, truth, victory, and even paradoxical things like strife are counted among the me. In one famous story, Enki gathers the me in his shrine at Eridu. Inanna travels there, and in a lively exchange obtains a set of them and carries them back to Uruk. The tale is playful, but the message is serious. Civilized life depends on a structured package of powers that the gods control and can distribute. This cosmic order also needs a place for judgment. The Sumerians considered fate to be a fixed thread once it was spoken by the council. Enlil is often called the one who decrees destinies. In other texts, the whole assembly of the Anunnaki is said to have spoken the outcomes of ages and kings. That is how a mythic universe maintains stability, not through constant miracles, but through a shared understanding among the highest beings about how things are supposed to go. Geography anchors the theology. Nippur is the seat of Enlil and the stage for high decisions. Eridu holds Enki's sweet waters and becomes the source of crafts and wisdom. Keeps the time of the moon and turns that time into calendars and festivals. Uruk celebrates Inanna and ties beauty and might to civic life. Sippar and Lhasa shine for Utu and link sunlight to law. When you map these cities, you are mapping the body of the pantheon across the plain. One striking detail is how human the gods can seem without losing grandeur. They eat offerings, they wear robes and jewelry, they ride in processions, they take offense and reconcile. They act like a royal house whose moods matter to everyone who lives down the street. This is not because Sumerians could not imagine abstraction. It is because they wanted a world that could be addressed. A farmer with a problem needs a god who can listen and act. A king who needs a sign looks for a council that can vote. If you wanted to meet the Anunnaki on a workday, you would begin at Nippur. Not the city as archaeologists dig it today, but the living place that once lay at the bend of a canal. Picture broad courts, paved with beaten clay, doorways set with cedar beams, and a great terrace where the temple of Enlil lifted its brick shoulders above the plain. Priests strode through the courts with reed bundles in their arms, scribes pressed tablets on their thighs, and messengers carried small sealed jars that held oil for lamps and offerings. To a Sumerian, Nippur was more than a city. It was the meeting point of earth and the unseen. It was where the great gods gathered to decide how the year would go. The Anunnaki operated like a council. They did not rule by accident or whim. They sat in assembly and issued decrees. The word that appears in so many texts is destiny. Once spoken by the council, a destiny was fixed. A king who held his throne with ease was a man who had been approved in that court. A king who struggled had missed a vote he needed. If a river cut a new channel and spared a district from flood, people said the Anunnaki had decided it would be so. When trouble arrived, the complaint went upward by prayer and offering in the hope that the council would reconsider. Sumerians loved lists, and this taste for order shows up in their theology. Poets speak of the me, the divine ordinances that make civilization possible. These are the building blocks of culture. Music belongs on the list. So do weaving, bricklaying, fair judgment, and kingship. The Anunnaki hold these powers. They can bestow them, withdraw them, or pass them from one city to another. In the myth that scholars call Enki and the world order, Enki tours the lands and assigns oversight to different gods. Grain and cattle receive their keepers. Rivers receive their guardians. Marshes, mountains, and sea coasts are given to deities who suit them. It is a tidy picture because the Sumerians believed that a tidy cosmos was a livable one. When a new ruler took office, he did not merely seize a chair. He came to Nippur for recognition. The ritual language says that Enlil fixed the king's fate. In practice, that meant the priesthood accepted him, processions were held, and oaths were sworn in the names of the great gods. Seals from this world show a seated deity handing a rod and ring to a human figure. The scene is not random art. It is an explanation in miniature. Authority is a measured thing. It comes from the divine court and is given to a city through its chosen leader. The Anunnaki were imagined as very present beings. Artists carved them with horned crowns that signaled divinity, long beards, and robes with patterned hems. A few images hint at an aura that scholars call melam, a radiant presence that made hair stand and knees soften. Yet they were human enough to hold a banquet, to take advice, and to frown at poor manners. This mix of grandeur and familiarity made them approachable in ritual. A farmer could pour beer at a small shrine because he believed the great ones listened even when busy with weighty matters. People did not worship the Anunnaki as a single unit. There was no temple of the Anunnaki with a combined staff and a single cult statue. Devotion focused on individual gods. Enlil at Nippur, Inanna at Uruk, Enki at Eridu, Nana at Utu at Sippar and Lhasa. Each city served its patron with festivals, food offerings, and music. Yet the group name mattered. In oaths, scribes sometimes invoked the Anunnaki to witness a boundary or a treaty. It was a way of calling the whole court as notaries. If you broke the oath, you did not merely offend one god. You insulted the senior board. Divination grew out of this belief that decisions were made above. If the council set the line of events, people wanted a way to read that line before it reached them. Mesopotamians developed a craft for this. Priests poured oil on water and studied the shapes made by the film. They watched the stars and drew up long lists that connected signs in the sky with events on Earth. They studied the livers of sacrificial sheep and read the marks on the surface like a message. These were not party tricks. They were serious efforts to ask, has the court already spoken? And if so, what did it say? The Omen series that later scholars call Enuma Anu Enlil shows how systematic this could become. A red glow around the moon meant one thing for the harvest. A wind from a given quarter during an eclipse meant something else for a campaign. Scribes recorded all this activity with a care that feels modern. A tablet might read that on a certain day of a certain month, a priest observed a sign, and that the sign matched a known entry in an omen list. Another tablet might note that a king vowed a gift to Enlil if he returned safely from a march, and that he fulfilled the vow on the third day after his return. Foundation deposits buried under new walls included small objects and written prayers to the gods, asking them to protect the building and to favor the city that built it. The habit is both practical and devout. It is insurance in the oldest sense. You do your work, and then you ask the highest court to co-sign it. The council also set the pace of the ritual year. Each city had its own calendar, but the logic was shared. New moons marked beginnings. Planting and harvest brought processions into the streets. Lamentations were sung in lean times. Joyful hymns were sung when canals filled and fields turned green. In later Babylon, the new year would become a grand civic rite in which a king took the hand of a god and walked through the city. But the roots of that idea lay in Sumer, where public life and divine favor moved in step. It is tempting to imagine that such a court would be calm and above quarrel. The stories suggest otherwise. The Anunnaki agreed on the structure of things. They did not always agree on the details. Hymns praise Enlil as a stern ruler who keeps order, but also note that his judgments can be severe. Enki gains a reputation for finding a humane path when rigid decrees prove harmful. Inanna pushes boundaries and forces new outcomes when old customs block change. This is not squabbling for its own sake. It is a way to explore how a society balances needs. Order holds, mercy matters. Energy breaks, stalemate. Two features of this world help explain why the council always mattered. First, Mesopotamia was unstable by nature. Rivers shifted. Drought years came. Neighboring cities eyed each other's fields. A shared belief that destinies were set above gave emotional ballast. Second, the economy was collective at its core. Irrigation required a workforce moving in step. If the leadership could present decisions as confirmed by the Anunnaki, people were more likely to accept hard assignments. When the canal roster came out, a foreman could show the tablet and say that the gods approve this schedule. Grumble if you must, but bring your baskets. There was also a darker edge to the faith. If destinies were fixed, failure could be read as a sign that a fate had turned. A city that fell might compose a lament that said its patron god had left the temple. Priests would carry the statue away in ritual and sing for its return. These poems are moving to read even now. They speak of gates broken, fires in the courtyards, and empty streets where singers once walked. The cure for such grief was always the same: rebuild the walls, re-roof the halls, make offerings, invite the council to bless the work, wait for the verdict to change. By the time we reach the later part of the second millennium, the idea of a formal object called the Tablet of Destinies appears in myth. In one story, a proud being steals it from the house of Enlil, and chaos follows until the tablet is recovered. The tale enlarges a simple idea. If you remove the authority that fixes outcomes, the world shakes. Return the authority to its place, and order resumes. The picture that emerges is clear. The Anunnaki are not flashes of storm and fire. They are the architecture behind events. Their court gives shape to a year, a rain, a harvest, and a war. Their signs are written in the sky and in the liver of a sheep, in the successful launch of a barge and in the safe return of a caravan. Their images wear horns because rank should be obvious. Their gifts are measured because power without measure is not power at all. And all of this was as real to a Sumerian as the feel of wet clay and the sound of a millstone. The Sumerians did not leave their gods sitting on high thrones without errands. They set them to work, and then they told stories about how that work was done. If you walk the shelves of their tablets, you find a busy calendar of divine tasks that explains why the world looks the way it does. The point was never to dazzle. The point was to make sense of rivers, fields, kingship, justice, and the sometimes baffling turns of fortune. A good place to begin is a composition scholars call Enki and the World Order. It reads like a tour and a briefing combined. Enki sets out from his home at Eridu and assigns responsibilities as he goes. He gives the marshes their keepers and their reeds. He appoints guardians for the Tigris and the Euphrates. He names deities who will mind grain, cattle, carpentry, metalwork, and weaving. Mountains get their overseers. Seacoasts receive theirs. The story is very Sumerian in spirit. It treats the cosmos almost as an irrigation system that needs competent foremen. Enki acts like a chief engineer with a talent for matching roles to talents. If you grew up in a land where the wrong canal gauge could ruin a year, you would find this comforting. The idea that culture itself is a set of powers entrusted to cities appears again in the tale of the Me. These are the divine ordinances that make civilized life possible. They include music, writing, kingship, truth, skilled trades, and the practical and awkward things that life requires, even rivalry and conflict. In one lively episode, Inanna goes to Enki at Eridu and persuades him to pour the me into a boat. She sails for Uruk with the cargo, while Enki wakes, realizes what has happened, and sends creatures to stop her. They fail. Inanna arrives at Uruk with the gifts, and the city blooms with new arts and institutions. It is an origin story that avoids thunder in favor of logistics. A goddess brings home the toolkit of culture. Her people get to work. Kingship itself needed a mythic stamp of approval. The Sumerian king list is a sober little text that provides it. It claims that kingship descended from heaven. It then marches through a sequence of cities and rulers to show how that gift moved over time. Before the flood, it rests in Eridu, then Bad Tibira, then Larak, then Sippar, then Shuruppak. After the flood, it reappears at Kish. The list is not accurate history by modern standards, but it shows how people understood political change. When a city rose, it was because the council of the great gods had handed it the office. When a city fell, the office moved on. The Anunnaki do not appear in person in the king list, yet their hand is everywhere in its logic. Order comes from above. Authority is borrowed, never owned. In long narrative poetry, the Anunnaki appear at the edges of crucial scenes, and their presence carries weight. The best-known example lies inside the Epic of Gilgamesh. There, an old survivor tells of a flood that drowned the world. It was not a random storm. It was a decision. The great gods had agreed to silence humankind, whose noise had grown unbearable. The flood comes. The chosen man survives by building a boat on a warning from a friendly god. When the waters sink, he offers a sacrifice. The text says that the gods gather like flies around the smoke because they have gone hungry without human offerings. The line is vivid and slightly sardonic, and it tells you how Sumerians thought about the bond between heaven and earth. People feed the gods with festivals and altars. The gods keep the world in working order, break the arrangement, and both sides suffer. Justice also has a divine procedure. Utu, whom Akkadian speakers call Shamash, is the sun and the judge. He hears petitions and travels the sky to see what people do when they think no one is looking. In art, he carries a saw-toothed symbol and steps through the horizon gates at morning as if stepping into a court. When an oath is sworn on a canal bank or in a temple court, Utu and the Anunnaki are called to witness it. That is more than a flourish. It is a way to say that a promise binds in multiple realms. The written tablet records it in clay. The divine court records it in a place beyond tampering. From time to time, a story shows us the Anunnaki in a strictly judicial pose. The most striking is the descent of Inanna. The goddess decides to visit the realm of the dead, ruled by her sister Ereshkigal. She passes 7 gates, and at each gate leaves a piece of her regalia. At the deepest point, she is judged by 7 Anunnaki of the underworld. They do not argue. They pronounce. Inanna is struck down and hung on a hook. Only a clever rescue arranged by other gods brings her back. The message is stark. There are rules below as well as above, and the old high gods serve as judges in both places. That some texts use the name Anunnaki for chthonic judges, while others use it for the Celestial Council, tells you less about contradiction than about range. The same ancient powers oversee fate in every layer. Temple building is another duty wrapped in story. Gudea of Lagash left us long inscriptions about the instructions he received in a dream to rebuild the house of Ningirsu. He describes precise measurements, materials, and rites. He speaks of divine approval for every step, from choosing clay to setting door leaves. He calls on the great gods to bless the work and to dwell within it. Read alongside foundation deposits from other cities. You see a pattern. A ruler presents a bricks and mortar project as a response to a request from above. The Anunnaki are the ultimate planning board. When they approve, walls rise and last. There are quieter texts where the gods teach by proverb. The instructions of Shurapak sets out advice that a father gives a son. Do not move a boundary stone. Do not neglect the canal bank. Do not mistreat the wife of a soldier. Trust a reliable boatman. These are not thunderbolts. Yet they come wrapped in the authority of the earliest age, when wise kings heard the will of the gods. The effect is to weave divine duty into daily ethics. The Anunnaki do not appear as characters, but their expectations shape the advice. Boundaries matter because the gods hate disorder. Canal banks matter because a breach threatens the common good. The idea that the gods assign tasks also shapes military tales. Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta is a pair of long poems about a ruler of Uruk who seeks fine stone and metals from a far land in the mountains. He invokes Inanna as his patron. He sends a herald with demands and boasts. He proposes riddles and spells. At several points, the gods tip the balance in his favor, not with lightning, but with the gift of language. One version claims that once there was a time when all people spoke one tongue and that the god of wisdom changed it. The poems sit at the edge of myth and memory, but the theme stays familiar. The success of a city depends on whether its patron can persuade the council to grant it what it needs. Catalogues of offerings add detail to these grand themes. We have lists from Uruk and and other cities that tally what was given to which god on which day. Barley, beer, bread, dates, oxen, sheep, birds, fish, perfumes. The quantities are large and often specific. Behind the numbers lies a simple premise. An orderly world asks its people to keep up their side of the bargain. If you want the Anunnaki to keep decreeing harvests, victories, and safe returns, you keep their kitchens and their music staffed. When trouble comes, you do not accuse. You add offerings, sing laments, and ask the court to reconsider. Divination manuals complete the picture of divine duty with a frankness that is almost scientific. Clay models of sheep livers carry labels for zones and marks. Each feature has an interpretation grounded in long observation and a memory of outcomes. Celestial omens are logged the same way. When Mars appears near a certain star and a wind blows from a certain quarter, scribes note what happened the last time and the time before that. This is not magic used as spectacle. It is a record-keeping habit applied to belief. The Anunnaki set the line of events. People try to read it honestly. By the later centuries of Mesopotamian religion, new epics would place younger gods at the center of creation stories, and the Old Council would be pictured as a large assembly counted by the hundreds. Those later developments do not erase the older pattern. In Sumer, the Anunnaki are the elders who organize the world and continue to serve as the court of record. They assign the me. They approve rulers. They bless or withdraw blessing from cities. They judge in life and judge in death. Their work is not fireworks. It is administration at the largest scale. All of this leads to the most consequential task the gods ever undertook. They needed workers for the endless chores of a living world. The junior gods were tired of dredging canals and hauling baskets. The elders considered a remedy and chose a path that would change the story of the earth from that moment on. The story begins with work. Not our work, but the work of gods who found themselves doing the sort of chores that make shoulders ache. After the great separation of heaven and earth, the world needed canals, fields, and boundaries. The junior gods, called the Igigi in later Akkadian texts, were given the hard labor. They dug channels through wet clay, raised levees, and cut brick by brick the foundations of temples. For a long time they endured. Some versions say 40 years, others say longer, and the number matters less than the feeling. Time passed in the rhythm of baskets filled and carried. songs kept pace, shoulders burned. The revolt arrives like a gust out of a hot night. In the old Babylonian poem that scholars call Atrahasis, the worker gods can carry no more. They march as a group to the house of Enlil at Nippur. They do not knock. They surround the gates and throw down their tools, which is an image that would have made any Mesopotamian nod in recognition. A strike is a strike whether you are divine or human. Nusku, Enlil's vizier, brings word to his master that the canal crews are in open defiance. Enlil is furious. He calls for punishment. Then the senior gods think again. Breaking your own workforce has consequences. Enki, also called Ea, offers a plan that is at once practical and deeply imaginative. He proposes the making of a new creature to take up the hard tasks. This will not be a beast of burden, but a being that can understand, command, accept ration, and keep time. A being who can stand before a shrine with steady hands. To do this, Enki says, you must mix clay from the life-bearing ground with something that carries divine purpose. The council agrees. A single god from among the rebels will be selected, not as a scapegoat alone, but as a source of living essence. In different tablets, the name varies. Some call him Geshtu, which carries the sense of intelligence. Others use Ilawela. The idea is the same. A god whose mind is a store of knowledge will provide the blood that turns clay into a creature who can learn. The scene in the workshop feels vivid even on a broken tablet. Nintu, also known as Ninhursag or Mami, takes the lead as birth goddess. Enki brings clay from the deep waters under the land, the sweet water domain that the Sumerians called the Abzu. The blood of the chosen god is mixed into the clay. Rituals are spoken over the bowl. 7 and 7 birth goddesses are assembled, each to shape and carry a portion. They place the forms in a kind of womb house. Months pass, counted with care because nothing in Mesopotamia escapes the calendar. When the time is right, the womb house opens and the first humans emerge. The text pauses here, as if someone in the room took a breath and looked closely at the faces of those who had just arrived. These new beings, called people without fanfare, are immediately given assignments. The purpose is clear. They will carry the baskets that the Ajiji carried. They will dredge the canals. They will tend the temple fields, grind grain, brew beer, bake bread, and raise walls. They will maintain the inner order of the temple courts with brooms drawn from reed beds. In return, they will receive rations, clothing, and protection. The gods will be relieved of a burden that was never theirs to bear for long. Humans will now stand between earth and heaven as a working link. The poem does not stop with a single act of creation. It imagines a system. Humans multiply, and with growth come new problems. Rations need to be tallied. Labor needs to be organized. The first records of human life in the tablets echo the promise in the myth. We see corvées, rosters that send men to dig canals by the week. We see lists of barley assigned to workers. We see temple inventories that measure loaves, jars, and animals for offerings. The new creature has stepped fully into the complex that Sumer had built. Clay tablets track clay bodies at work. Enki's role throughout is not that of a distant maker, but of a patron who wants the design to hold. He grants knowledge in stages. He teaches the use of tools, the making of bricks, and the handling of boats along the canal bends. He sets out instructions for how to bring sweet water into fields while letting salt wash away. In one set of lines, he quietly arranges that midwives will learn their craft and that women will know how to bring children into the world safely. The myth cares about survival on a very practical level. Nintu, as mother of mankind, is not merely a ceremonial figure. She grieves when mortality enters the story, and she rejoices when order returns after crisis. In one scene, she counts the years that a person should live and marks that count on a small tablet of destiny. Mortality is not a punishment alone in this tradition. It is a boundary that allows a crowded world to function. The gods learn, and humans learn, that limits can be a mercy when the alternative is ruin. You can feel the memory of real labor behind these lines. Canals buckle when a flood eats at the bank. Salts creep into soil and stunt a field for seasons. The myth addresses this without preaching. It says that the decision to create humans was a decision to share responsibility. The gods retain the high work of decree. People take on the groundwork of maintenance. Every time a scribe lists a crew for dredging or a builder sets a reed mat under a new course of bricks, the poem's logic is confirmed. The Atrahasis tablets that have come down to us are copies made in scribal schools in places like Sippar and Ashur during the second millennium before the Common Era. They preserve older Sumerian ideas within Akkadian language. The text moves with a steady hand from revolt to plan to creation to consequence. The detail that a god's blood is mixed into clay is not a grisly flourish. It is a statement about why humans can understand tasks and speak with the gods. Something of intelligence and authority sits in the mix. Sumerian and Akkadian art, when placed next to the poem, strengthens the impression that this was meant to explain life as it was lived. Reliefs show long files of laborers crossing a plain with baskets balanced on their shoulders. Cylinder seals show boats poling along canals and workers leading oxen to a threshing floor. Early law collections from cities like Ur and Eshnunna set out penalties for neglecting a canal or for moving a boundary stone to steal water. The words of law and the words of myth support each other. Everyone understood that water management was sacred work because the gods had placed that work in human hands. There is also humor in the tradition, dry and precise, that keeps the story from becoming solemn. When the Ajiji throw down their tools, a narrator hints that even eternal beings have their limits and that it is no insult to admit it. When the first sacrifices are offered by the new humans, the gods respond like hungry officials who have waited too long for lunch. These touches are not meant to mock. They remind us that the divine household behaves like a household, and that the sacred is not always distant thunder. The most striking consequence of the new arrangement arrives later, but its shadow falls across the creation scene. Once people thrive, their noise and smoke climb to the sky in a way that annoys the sternest of the great gods. The council debates population and policy. Enki continues to look for humane answers when others grow impatient. That next turn belongs to the flood story, a tale of near ending and uneasy mercy, which deserves its own careful telling. The oldest flood story in cuneiform does not open with thunder. It opens with a complaint about noise. Humans had multiplied, and their clamor rose in the night like the buzz of a marsh in high summer. Enlil, who preferred order and quiet, decided that the world had become unmanageable. The council met. A series of measures followed that feel eerily like policy in a city that has grown too fast. First came plague. When that failed to make a lasting difference, the gods tried famine. When famine did not quiet the world for long, they tried drought. Enki, who had a soft spot for the new creatures, quietly advised people on how to survive each crisis. He suggested offerings to the plague god to remove the pest. He suggested fishing and grain substitutes to counter famine. He told people to dig deeper for water when the canals ran low. Each time, human ingenuity and divine sympathy blunted the blow. At last, Enlil proposed a final remedy. A flood would wash the land clean. The council agreed. The gods swore an oath of silence and bound each other not to warn humankind. Enki found a way around the letter of that promise without breaking its spirit. He went to the house of a wise man in Shuruppak, a city on the Euphrates. The man is called Atrahasis in the old Babylonian poem, and Ziusudra in earlier Sumerian tradition. In the later epic of Gilgamesh, he appears as Utnapishtim. Enki spoke to the wall of the man's reed house as if it were an oracle. Reed wall, listen. The wall had ears. The man listened through the wall and learned what he must do. The instructions are practical, down to the choice of materials. Tear down the house and build a boat. Abandon property and save life. Put aboard the seed of all living things. Smear the seams with bitumen so they hold. Bitumen was plentiful in Mesopotamia. It bubbled from the ground near the lower rivers and was used for caulking boats and setting bricks. A riverboat could be made of wood and reeds, but without bitumen it would leak like a sieve. The hero gathered carpenters, rope makers, reed cutters, and pitch burners. He paid them well. He told the elders that the work was for the favor of the god. He loaded animals, craftsmen, and family. He took silver and gold, and every skill he could store in a hold, because after a flood you need more than food. Then the sky turned black. In the poems, the storm god roars and the light is gone. The torrent falls with a violence that bends trees and rips levees. The foundations of the land give way. In one version, the storm lasts 6 days and 7 nights. In another, the count is different, but the effect is the same. The world becomes one broad sea. People cling to rooftops that have become rafts and then disappear. The boat rides it out, pitching like a reed basket on a boiling pool. There is a moment in the story that tells you how the Mesopotamians imagined their gods. While the waters rage, the gods are frightened. They cower at the edge of the sky like dogs in a thunderstorm. When the flood begins to sink, the hero opens a hatch and light pours in. He looks for land. He sends out a dove. It returns. He waits and sends out a swallow. It returns. He waits again and sends out a raven. The raven finds a perch and does not come back. This is the signal he needs. He opens the boat and steps onto solid ground. In the Sumerian version, Ziusudra bows toward the 4 corners and offers a sacrifice. In the Akkadian versions, Atrahasis and Utnapishtim do the same. They stack wood, burn sweet reeds, and pour out drink for the gods. The smell of roasting meat rises. The text says the gods gather like flies around the sacrifice. It is a comic image with a hard truth behind it. For as long as the flood lasted, there were no offerings. The gods, who had been quick to act, now feel hunger and remorse. Ishtar laments the decision. Enlil sees the smoke and realizes that some humans have survived. He is furious that the oath was bent. Enki does not deny it. He speaks up for mercy and reason. He says there are other ways to restrain a noisy world than drowning it. He proposes that human lives be shorter. He proposes gaps in fertility and limits on childbearing. The details vary from tablet to tablet, but the logic stays plain. Instead of wiping the slate clean in rage, adjust the terms of life so that the earth can carry the weight. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim receives a unique reward. The gods grant him and his wife a life that does not end, and they send them to live far away at the mouth of the rivers. This is not a blessing handed out to others. It is an exception that underscores the rule. Mortality will set the rhythm for everyone else. In the Sumerian Ziusudra tale, the hero receives life like the gods and a place in the land of Dilmun, a far shore that later poets associated with purity and dawn. In all versions, the flood becomes a line in memory. Before the flood, kingship resided in a sequence of cities that now feel unreal. After the flood, it starts again in Kish and moves through a map we can trace in archaeology. Archaeologists have looked for layers that might match the event. At Shurupak and at there are deposits of river clay that suggest a major flood in the early 3rd millennium. The layers are not uniform across the land, nor do they represent a world ocean, but they show what people in a delta learn the hard way. Rivers can drown your city when they change course, and when that happens, memory calls it the flood to end all floods. The idea traveled well. The biblical story of Noah keeps the core plot and the sequence of birds. It drops the polytheist council and keeps a single God who judges and then promises not to repeat the act. In both traditions, a boat and a family preserve life, and a new start follows with laws and rituals to keep chaos at bay. Boat building in the poem matches what we know of Mesopotamian craft. Reeds bundled into strong ribs, planks pegged together, ropes wound tight, seams pounded full of pitch. The region had no forests like Lebanon, so large timbers were rare and precious. A well-made riverboat looked like a long basket with a spine. It was perfect for canals and flats. A storm at sea would shred it, but the hero did not need a seaboat. He needed a sealed box that would float over a drowned plane. Religion after the flood takes on a new tone. There is more attention to lament and to the careful marking of sin and restitution. When kings in later centuries rebuilt temples, they often said they did so to restore order that had been shaken. A few texts present the idea that priestesses who serve in certain roles must not bear children, which some scholars see as a memory of the new limits imposed after the flood. The span of human life in the king list drops from the fantastic ages before the flood to plausible reigns after. The myths place a ceiling over a world that had once felt limitless. The flood story also changes how you hear the earlier creation scene. Humans were made to carry burdens that gods no longer wished to bear. The flood is the mid-course correction when the system strains. Both stories speak to a society that knew the cost of irrigation and the danger of crowding on a narrow strip of arable land. In a plain where a broken levee could force a city to move, you would tell your children that large decisions have consequences, and you would teach them to keep their canals clear and their rituals regular. There is kindness in the tale even with all the ruin. Enki searches for a way to save a remnant. He instructs without grandstanding. He honors skill. The hero follows instructions, pays his workers, and loads not only animals and food but tools, seeds, and craft. When the waters recede, the world restarts with a full kit. That is a Mesopotamian kind of hope. It is not a promise that nothing will go wrong. It is a promise that if you plan, if you keep your accounts, and if you honor the powers above, you can rebuild even after catastrophe. In the end, the flood becomes a hinge. Before it, gods and humans test how to share a world. After it, they live with rules that both sides accept. People bring offerings with a sober understanding of why they do it. Gods accept offerings with a memory of hunger that makes them patient. Kings claim their crowns as a loan that can be revoked. Scribes record the years as a careful ledger of favor and fault. The river still rises each spring. The levees hold because thousands of hands keep them sound. Civilizations do not turn pages with a single gesture. They smudge them, cross them out, and write over them in a hand that looks familiar and new at once. That is how Sumer gave way to Babylon. The ancient cities on the lower rivers did not vanish. Still kept moontime. Nippur still guarded the idea of sacred authority. Eridu still whispered of first things. But a new center of gravity appeared on the plain, and with it a new way to tell the story of the world. Babylon began as one more city among many, Traders knew its quays, scribes knew its measures. Then came a line of Amorite rulers who understood both law and spectacle. The most famous of them, Hammurabi, carved judgments in stone and managed alliances with a patient talent that still impresses. He knitted a tapestry of cities into something like a kingdom. When rulers built states, priests built theologies that fit them. In Babylon, that meant lifting a local god to a position from which he could explain everything. The god was Marduk. His name had been around for centuries without special shine. Then Babylon rose, and Marduk rose with it. Priests and poets took up reeds and clay and produced a creation epic for the ages. We call it by its opening words, Enuma Elish. It begins with Apsu and Tiamat, the sweet water below and the salt water above, the raw mingling from which the gods first emerged. Younger gods make noise. Apsu grows weary and plans to silence them. And from the contest comes a champion who will put an end to chaos. In the Sumerian house, that job once belonged to powers like Enlil or Ninurta. In the Babylonian retelling, Marduk steps forward. The narrative is confident and cinematic. Marduk receives the emblem of authority, tests his weapons, and faces Tiamat, the primal sea who has birthed a host of monsters and set Kingu at their head. The duel ends with victory as certain as sunrise. Marduk splits Tiamat, sets half as the dome of the sky, and stretches the other as the deep. He fixes the courses of planets and stars so that time can be read. He orders the calendar. He organizes winds. He appoints stations for the great lights. He decides that there will be a nether sea and a circle of lands above it, where cities can be raised and kept. A single decision in the poem tells you how the Babylonians framed human purpose. The older gods complain of heavy work. Marduk answers in a way that echoes the Sumerian logic and updates it. He takes Kingu, the leader of the rebels, and from his blood he fashions humankind. People will carry the labor that wearies divine shoulders. They will maintain temples, canal banks, and city walls. They will sing, count, brew, carve, and lift. In return, they will receive law and care. It is a contract as old as the plain and as fresh as the new throne in Babylon. Once the world is ordered and humans are set to their tasks, the poem reaches its chief purpose. The Great Assembly recognizes Marduk as king of the gods. They give him 50 names, each a title that claims a function once associated with other powers. He is called the one who establishes decrees, the one who renews, the one who brings life, the one who conquers the sea, the one who gives pasture, the one who restores cities after ruin. He is not the sky father An. He is not the old ruler Enlil. He is the executive power in an age that admired energy and repair. The Anunnaki, who in earlier ages sat as senior partners at the top, now become a wider company counted by the hundreds and arranged under Marduk. Some lists divide them as 300 of the heavens and 300 of the earth, a neat symmetry that would have pleased a Babylonian accountant. This was not only literature, it was liturgy and pageantry. Each spring, when fields began to green and the river settled into its channels, Babylon held the New Year festival, the Akitu. Statues of the gods were carried from their temples through the streets. Priests chanted the lines of Enuma Elish in halls heavy with cedar scent and lamp smoke. The king entered the temple of Marduk, the Esagila, a complex so large and layered that later travelers thought it impossible. There he underwent a ritual that humbled and crowned him in the same hour. The high priest stripped him of regalia and struck his cheek hard enough to draw tears. If the king wept, the omen was good. The god accepted him. He received his scepter again and led the procession to the Akitu house outside the walls. The year could begin in order, Babylon was never shy about architecture. The Temple of Marduk was joined in memory with a stepped tower that later ages called Anunnaki, the house that is the foundation of heaven and earth. Its bricks lifted a visible axis between ground and sky. Generations rebuilt it after floods and wars, because such a pillar told people that their city aligned with the universe. The effect on visitors must have been profound, to walk those courts and hear the epic recited while the king of a growing empire stood before the statue of the new chief god was to feel that history had tilted. None of this erased the older pantheon. It reorganized it. Enki, now called Ea in Akkadian, remained the thoughtful counselor and patron of wisdom and craft. Inanna carried on as Ishtar, brilliant and dangerous, a goddess who could bless a city with power and turn the tide of war. Utu walked the sky as Shamash, lighting the world and judging disputes. Nanna gave its silver nights as Sin. Nergal, Ereshkigal, and a host of chthonic powers kept their seats below. The word Anunnaki continued to denote the Great Assembly, but its center of gravity had shifted. Decision now ran through Babylon's divine court. Politics beyond the temple supported the myth. Hammurabi's laws, set in neat columns beneath a carved scene of the king receiving a rod and ring from Shamash, announced to judges and merchants that justice had a source and a style. Canals were dredged and recut. Storehouses were tallied. Fields were resurveyed after floods. When Babylon faltered, other powers took up versions of the same template. The Cassates, who later ruled from Babylon, adopted Marduk and treated the city as a sacred trust. The Assyrians to the north lifted their own god Ashur and wrote epics, where Ninurta or Ashur stood in roles once filled by Marduk. But when they conquered Babylon, they still staged reconciliations and restorations because the city and its theology conferred a legitimacy that no army alone could supply. Texts from this era show the new arrangement working at every level. Incantations invoke Marduk and Ea together as healer and counselor. Scholars compiled Great Omen series that treated the sky as a lettered board from which the gods wrote advisories each night. Priests expanded temple inventories into encyclopedias of offerings, gate guardians, and household rituals. Scribal schools copied Enuma Elish and hymns that list the 50 names as if memorization itself were a form of praise. When kings rebuilt walls after a siege, they buried foundation deposits that named Marduk as the one who allowed brick and timber to meet again. The Tablet of Destinies, a symbol of fixed authority that had flickered through earlier myth, appears with new clarity. In Assyrian and Babylonian versions of the old battles, victory returns the tablet to its rightful owner, without which no command holds. The lesson is clear. Legitimacy matters as much as force. A city can win a battle and still lose the year if it cannot convince heaven that the order of things has been respected. The new theology was a theory of statecraft as much as cosmology. There is a practical cleverness in how Babylon framed its god. Marduk does not simply crush monsters and sit. He sets calendars, assigns posts, names, stars, and restores cities. He models what an empire needed from its center. The priests who sang his titles were telling their king and their people that a real ruler does not only command, he organizes, he cleans up. He remembers that a canal silted for a season can starve a district for a year. If you lay older Sumerian tablets beside this Babylonian corpus, you see both continuity and change. The creation of people from a mix of divine blood and earthly material reappears with a new culprit and a new patron. The divine council retains its form, but adjusts its seating chart. The me, the gifts that make culture run, are now folded into the names that Marduk bears. Festivals that once honored many centers now converge on one city and one ritual march. The map has been redrawn, but most of the landmarks remain. In daily life, the shift meant that merchants and farmers in Babylon moved through a city that claimed to be the hinge of heaven and earth. They passed through gates, named for gods known across the Near East. They counted their days by a calendar that matched the epic and the sky. They took disputes to judges who sat under reliefs of Shamash and swore oaths that called the Anunnaki and Marduk to witness. It is no surprise that later ages remembered Babylon as the very idea of city, a place where power and learning met. The rise of Marduk did more than glorify a patron. It gave later generations a way to narrate their own changes. When Assyrian kings carved their triumphs on palace walls, they borrowed the imagery of dragon slaying and world ordering. When Persian satraps managed riverlands, they adopted the administrative habits that Babylon had refined. When scholars in Seleucid and Parthian times looked up to plot the movements of planets, they used tables that came from the same temple complexes where Enuma Elish had been chanted each spring. By the end of this chapter in the long story, the Anunnaki have not vanished. They have been absorbed into a larger imperial vision. They remain the old powers in the background, while a younger champion stands at the front of the stage. The gods of Sumer are now the cabinet of Babylon. Their authority flows through a single office. Their festivals feed a single procession that carries the year on its shoulders. If the Sumerians invented the template of ordered cosmos, the Babylonians wrote its manual and issued it with a seal. If you had asked a Sumerian farmer who the Anunnaki were, he might have said they were the high family of the sky. Ask his great-great-grandson in late Babylon, and you might hear that the Anunnaki sit in the dark and pass judgment on the dead. The name did not change. The job description did. It is one of those long cultural turns that does not announce itself. It shows up line by line in hymns, oaths, and laments, until one day the old council of heaven is just as much a court below. The journey begins in story. In the tale of Inanna's descent, the queen of Uruk decides to go down to the realm of her sister Ereshkigal. She passes through 7 gates, leaves her ornaments, and stands stripped before the law of the underworld. There, 7 Anunnaki sit as judges. They do not bargain. They declare guilt and fix a penalty. Inanna is struck down and hung on a hook until clever help from above secures her return. The point is not cruelty. It is that the world below has rules, and those rules are guarded by the ancient powers who once set the fates on high. The same firmness that kept heaven and earth in their lanes now keeps the dead where they belong. Other texts echo the change. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the heroes speak of the Anunnaki who decree death and who now dwell with Ereshkigal. Incantations that priests used against illness and curses list the Anunnaki among the chthonic powers called to witness oaths and punish false swearing. Hittite treaties from the highlands bring them in as underworld enforcers. The proud old title becomes the name you invoke when you want a promise to hold even beyond the grave. There is a useful pairing that scribes began to use in the first millennium. Igigi for the gods of the open sky, Anunnaki for the gods beneath. The words do not appear out of nowhere. They reflect a steady sorting of the pantheon into functions that fit a world of empire and archives. The heavens fill with bright signs for scholars to read. The depths fill with judges and wardens who keep the dead in order. The arrangement is neat, which was always dear to Mesopotamian hearts. To understand why this mattered, you have to picture the Mesopotamian afterlife. It was not a field of bliss. It was a dim house called by names like Kur and Akala, where the dead lived, as shades who ate dust unless the living remembered them. The path led through gates kept by doorkeepers with proper names, across the river Hubur, where a boatman ferried new arrivals, and into a city ruled by Ereshkigal with Nergal at her side in some traditions. There were officials and scribes below just as there were above. There was a court. There were the Anunnaki. Burial customs grew from this view. Families poured beer and water for their ancestors at set times. They brought food. They called the names of the dead so that the shades would be fed and gentle. Tablets that scholars group under the name Kispu describe these offerings. Other tablets warn what happens when the chain breaks. A neglected dead person could return as a restless ghost and trouble a house. There were rituals for that too. Priests burned juniper, spoke the names of the underworld powers, and asked the Anunnaki to judge the case and send the spirit back to its place. Graves tell the same story in clay and metal. In the royal cemetery at early in the tradition, the dead of high rank went down with lyres, gold leaves, and carnelian beads, with oxen and attendants in a funerary pageant that looks extravagant until you remember the logic. To live well below, one needed a fraction of what one had above. Later, burials are less lavish, but often include bowls, lamps, and small tools. These are not random keepsakes. They are tokens of care for a journey that everyone expected to make. The Anunnaki show up in legal texts as guarantors of boundaries and oaths. Kassite and Babylonian boundary stones, the Kuduru stones carved with signs of gods, call on the Anunnaki to curse anyone who moves a marker or falsifies a grant. The curse lists are formulaic and stern. May the Anunnaki of the earth and the sky blind the offender. May they cut off his seed. May they make his house a ruin. It sounds harsh because property lines in a canal land are survival lines. If you respect the edge of a field, the courts above will favor you. If you do not, the courts below stand ready to finish the case. Laments belong here as well. When cities fell, poets sang long, sad poems that described the departure of patron gods, gates broken, and fires in courtyards. These laments often end with a hope that the gods will return and that the Anunnaki will soften. The poems were not entertainment. They were a way to ask the deepest authorities to reverse a fate. When a new ruler rebuilt a temple, he buried a tablet at the foundation asking the Anunnaki to watch over the walls and to punish anyone who dared to undo the work. The underworld court appears in rituals that cleansed omens and reset bad luck. The Namburbi texts are handbooks for undoing ill signs. If a house crack looks like a bad token or a dog howls in a pattern that bodes ill, the ritual tells you what to burn, what to bury, and which gods to address so that the sign does not ripen into fate. The underworld powers are part of this machinery. Once the Anunnaki have written a decision, it stands. If you want to prevent a bad decision, you act before the writing hardens. The mindset is legal and almost bureaucratic, even when it is spiritual. One god becomes a focus as the dark realm gains detail. Nurgle, a fierce lord associated with plague and war, pairs with Ereshkigal as king below in later tradition. Myths tell of his rough courtship and his descent to her throne. He is not an Anunnaki by birth in the old lists, yet he works with them in the same court. It is a reminder that titles shifted as duties grew, the old family name attached to the bench of judges. New officials took chairs beside them as the stories of empire demanded a full staff. The seven shows up again and again. 7 gates, 7 judges, 7 decrees. The number had symbolic weight across Mesopotamia. It organized lists and festivals. It also gave structure to dread. To pass 7 checkpoints is to pass a complete test. To face 7 judges is to face the full court. In spells and hymns, naming the 7 Anunnaki of the underworld was a way to say that you had consulted every authority that mattered. By the late 1st millennium, scribes loved to catalogue. Scholarly tablets list the names and epithets of underworld beings, with a neatness that almost hides the fear behind the writing. There are demons who guard thresholds, storm spirits who hunt the wicked, and recorded names for judges who hear suits brought by the dead. The Anunnaki are listed among these with their old gravitas intact. A learned priest could unroll a tablet and speak the right names in the right order to fit any case. This turn from heaven to below never erased the older memory. In hymns to Enlil you still hear that he sets fates on high. In prayers to Shamash you still find appeals to justice in daylight. The difference is that a complete world needed guardians everywhere. The Anunnaki as underworld judges filled that need. If an oath was broken in the open, the sun would see it. If guilt hid and the wrong died, the court below would see it. Justice could take a year or a lifetime, but someone would record it, and the senior judges would have their say. It helped that the cities themselves carried reminders that nothing lasts untouched. Floods laid down sterile clay across quarters that had been lively the year before. New kings moved capitals and left proud temples to quiet ruin. Families kept tablets of property and marriage, but knew that a generation or two could scatter them. In a land that taught impermanence every spring and every war season, it made sense to imagine a final ledger kept in a place that did not burn. The Anunnaki were the clerks and judges of that ledger. What you see, when you stand back, is an old title that proved useful in new circumstances. The Anunnaki once named the high family who sat in the bright court. Later, it named the senior bench below. The thread between the two is the idea of order. A world that began with separation of sky and earth needed guardians on both sides of the seam. The people of Sumer and Akkad and Babylon and Assyria watched their rivers, counted their days, and trusted that judgments made in the right names could hold a country together. The Anunnaki, wherever seated, supplied those names. For nearly 2,000 years, the names of An, Enlil, and Inanna faded to a murmur no louder than the desert wind that sifted through broken brick. Temples that once smelled of cedar smoke became hills of compacted clay. The rivers wandered. New kings raised new shrines to new gods. The scripts that kept the memory of Sumer and Akkad alive drifted out of use until no one could read a single sign. The old stories slept in the ground. Ancient writers preserved little. A Babylonian priest named Berossus wrote in Greek during the 3rd century before the Common Era, and later authors quoted him in fragments. He told of a creation from watery beginnings and of a great flood. He kept alive a rumor of the first cities on the lower rivers. Then the line of memory thinned. Roman authors had little interest in clay archives. Medieval travelers saw only mounds and masonry reused in village walls. Local farmers called some of the ruins the houses of the kings. No one could name the kings. What woke the past was curiosity sharpened by empire and a taste for proof. In the late 18th century, a Danish surveyor named Carsten Niebuhr copied strange wedge signs from monuments in Persia. Scholars in Europe compared them and suspected that the writing was a script and not decoration. Early in the next century, a German schoolmaster named Georg Friedrich Grotefend made a brave first guess at a few royal names in the simplest variety of the script. He was right often enough to keep hope alive. The script appeared in several forms. One was used for Old Persian, which helped because the names of kings were known from Greek historians. The other forms were older. They belonged to a world that few suspected still had a voice. The key lay high on a cliff in western Iran at a place called Behistun. There the Persian king Darius had ordered his glory carved in 3 languages. In the 1840s, an officer named Henry Rawlinson scaled the face of the rock and copied the wedge signs with the patience of a mountaineer and the stubbornness of a scholar. The Old Persian text could be read first, and that unlocked the Akkadian and Elamite versions beside it. Once a doorway opens, more doors follow. Within a few decades, scholars learned to read Akkadian, the language that had carried the literature of Assyria and Babylon. At last, the dead script began to speak. Excavation changed pace at the same time. In the 1840s, Paul Emile Botta dug at Khorsabad and astonished Europe with palaces of carved stone and winged bulls. Austin Henry Layard worked at Nimrud and Nineveh and shipped whole slabs of reliefs to London. He also uncovered the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, where scribes had stored thousands of clay tablets. These tablets were not books in the modern sense. They were notes, copies, hymns, and epics, arranged on shelves by subject. The British Museum and other collections began to fill with their brittle rectangles. Reading followed digging, and reading produced moments of wonder. In 1872, a young museum assistant named George Smith pieced together a broken tablet and realized he was looking at a flood story older than the one in Genesis. When he reached the part where a hero releases birds to test the water, he is said to have leapt up in excitement. His translation brought the Epic of Gilgamesh into public view and proved that the myths of the lower rivers could speak directly across millennia. The same libraries yielded Atrahasis with its creation of humans to carry the work of the gods, the descent of Ishtar, the Sumerian king list, and countless prayers and rituals. The word Anunnaki began to appear in footnotes, and then in main text, as scholars learned where it belonged. Another stream of recovery began farther south. In the 1880s, the University of Pennsylvania sent an expedition to Nippur, the old sacred city. They found vast temple ruins and deep tablet layers. The tablets there showed that Akkadian was not the only language of the old literature. Behind Akkadian lay Sumerian, a language with no known relatives, preserved because later scribes loved tradition and copied old hymns and myths for schoolwork. As Sumerian grammar yielded to study, a more ancient picture came into focus. Names once familiar only in Akkadian form showed their Sumerian shapes. Inanna looked out from behind Ishtar. Enki spoke before Ea. The term Anunna, the princely seed, explained the Akkadian Anunnaki. The new field needed a name. Assyriology came into use because the first spectacular finds were Assyrian, but the heart of the matter lay in the whole arc of Mesopotamia. Scholars built a craft from scratch. They taught students to copy signs with steady hands and to think like scribes who wrote on wet clay. They restored the layout of sign lists and lexical tables that ancient teachers used. They learned to date tablets by ductus, the shape and flow of signs, much as a paleographer dates a medieval script. They made concordances of mythic lines, so that a broken phrase in one copy could be restored from another. In the early 20th century, more discoveries filled the map. Robert Calderwood dug at Babylon for 18 years and traced the plan of the city, from the Ishtar Gate faced with blue-glazed bricks to the long processional street that led toward the Temple of Marduk. He showed how a city could be rebuilt again and again on the same footprint until the layers rose to the height of a hill. Sir Leonard Woolley excavated at Ur in the 1920s and 30s and brought to light the royal cemetery with its treasures of gold and lapis, its lyres and chariots, and its grim evidence of the old funerary pageants. He also cut trenches across the site and found a band of clean river clay that suggested a major flood in the 3rd millennium. His team carried out careful recording and set a standard for work in the region. As the 20th century advanced, a generation of scholars led by Thorkild Jacobsen and Samuel Noah Kramer turned raw texts into readable literature. Jacobsen wrote with a poet's ear about the early gods and the growth of city cults. Kramer published translations with introductions that made the clay come alive. His phrase that history begins at Sumer was catchy and not wrong. With each edition, the Anunnaki took a clearer shape. They appeared as the High Assembly in Sumerian hymns and narratives, as a group to whom destinies were assigned. In the later Akkadian tradition, they showed up as judges of the underworld. They were not a small list carved in stone, but a flexible term for the senior circle of divine authority. As more tablets were collated, the same scene came into view from different angles. Museums learned new ways to handle clay. Conservators hummed while they cleaned tablets with gentle tools and set broken edges together like puzzles. Infrared photography picked out faint wedge marks that the eye missed. Scholars mapped tablet find spots within rooms to understand how ancient librarians arranged knowledge. A shelf of omen texts in one corner and a bundle of incantations by a door told you about the daily needs of a temple or palace. Where curses invoked the Anunnaki to guard a boundary stone, the excavators usually found those stones buried in place near a field edge, snarled in roots and salt. The text and the landscape agreed. Archaeology also gave context to the mythology. The ziggurats of Ur and Uruk showed how temple towers would have dominated the skyline when hymns called gods to descend and bless a city. The stepped platforms under early temples at Eridu revealed the deep antiquity of Enki's cult on the Gulf shore, where sweet water and salt water meet. At Nippur, block by block, the E-Core precinct made sense of texts that placed Enlil at the center of the divine council. Cylinder seals from workshops in many cities pictured the seated deity handing a rod and ring to a human official. They were small, but they carried the same message as the law codes and the hymns. Authority is measured and given. The old idea of a high court that sets fates was not an abstraction to the people who made these things. It was the frame of their lives. Not every find fit neatly. For a time, there was debate about how to count the Anunnaki and which names to include in a roster. One text suggested hundreds ordered by heaven and earth. Another showed a solemn group of 7 in the underworld. Assyriologists learned not to force a single list onto centuries of changing practice. The term worked like a title that cities and periods applied in related ways. That is what living religions do. They carry a few strong ideas across generations and let details breathe. By mid-century, the outlines of the older world were plain enough to teach to undergraduates. The earliest cities grew in the Uruk period. Writing began with account keeping and flowered into literature. Sumerian and Akkadian coexisted for centuries and influenced each other. The divine household had a structure that mirrored civic life. The Anunnaki began as the children of the Sky Father and the Earth, then became the senior assembly that set destinies, and in later imagination sat as judges below. The flood myth traveled into later traditions. The Babylonian creation story elevated a city and its god without tearing down the whole house of older belief. It was a web of facts and texts, strong enough to hold weight. Outside of universities, interest grew as well. Museum galleries drew crowds with lions from gates and reliefs of kings hunting. Translations of Gilgamesh reached general readers. Teachers could point to a clay tablet and say, "Here is where a scribe pressed a sign 4,000 years ago and meant something we can still read." The distance between a modern reader and a Sumerian tablet felt smaller on days when the translation caught a joke or a sigh. A hymn might praise a god for bringing fresh water to parched fields, and a visitor who had watered a garden from a hose in July would nod. The rediscovery was not a straight climb. Wars interrupted fieldwork. Collections were scattered or damaged. Sites eroded while permits were debated. Yet, the story kept advancing because the sources were stubborn. Clay breaks, but it keeps writing better than papyrus or leather. A city that burned might leave behind a baked library. A fallen wall could seal rooms for later hands to open. Every season that teams returned to the ground brought another set of tablets to read and catalogue. Each new start felt like a conversation resumed. By the close of the century, a reader who walked into a good library could find entire series devoted to Mesopotamian religion and mythology. There were bilingual editions that put transliteration on one page and translation on the next. There were dictionaries to untangle Sumerian compounds and Akkadian verb stems. There were atlases that traced the changing courses of the rivers. In those books, the Anunnaki stood where they belonged, not as a curiosity, but as a core idea in how the people of the first cities organized the unseen. The long silence had ended in a chorus of small voices on clay. They told of a world where gods and people negotiated work and fate, where a council set rules, where old titles gathered new duties, and where an ancient word for a royal family became a term for the highest court in every realm. The Anunnaki had been lost, and then they were found, not as legends alone, but as lines and seals and bricks that you could hold in your hand. Once the tablets began to speak in modern languages, most readers were content to marvel at the poetry, the legal wit, and the stubborn practicality of the first cities. A few readers wanted something more explosive. They looked at gods who came from the sky and wondered if the sky meant what they think it means. That is how the Anunnaki moved from seminar rooms into late-night television and the brighter corners of popular imagination. The first big push came from writers who liked to ask whether ancient monuments required outside help. In the 1960s, a Swiss hotelier named Erich von Däniken filled pages with photos and questions. Did old stones show rockets? Did old myths describe machines? He wandered from Peru to Egypt and back to Mesopotamia, pointing and asking. His book sold in great numbers because the idea is flattering. If the ancients were talking to visitors from the stars, then we moderns are part of a grand cosmic club. Little of it stood up to close inspection, but the appetite for wonder was real. The leap that put the Anunnaki at the center came next. In the 1970s, Zecharia Sitchin published a book with a bold claim. He said the Sumerians did not only tell myths, they recorded history from a time when a wandering planet swept near the Earth on a long, cold orbit. He called that world Nibiru. He said its people were the Anunnaki. They came for gold to fix their atmosphere. They found early humans and saw potential. Enki, recast as a scientist with wet clay on his hands, worked out how to mix divine blood with the stock of a clever primate. The result was us. He said the tablets showed all of this for readers who knew how to look. It was a grand story. It felt like science because it used the language of planets and genes. It felt like theology because it gave purpose to creation and a role to gods who now had star charts. It also felt a little like a detective tale because only a few could supposedly read the clues. Readers by the millions bought the idea. More books followed. A generation later, television producers found a format that made these claims lively. A camera could sweep across a ziggurat, while a narrator spoke of visitors who brought writing and law. The word Anunnaki became a password. Say it, and you announced that you were in on an enormous secret. There was a second track alongside the spectacle. Scholars raised their hands and asked to return to the tablets. They pointed out that Nibiru in the late astronomical texts is a title that can mark a planet like Jupiter or the crossing place of the sky. They showed that Anunnaki in the earlier myths refers to the high circle of gods and not to travelers from cold space. They noted that creation from clay with divine blood is a ritual explanation for why humans can speak to the gods and not a laboratory note. They also reminded readers that orbits obey math, and that a large hidden world swinging through every few millennia would tug the rest of the system in ways we would have measured long ago. The divide between the two camps widened when dates were tied to prophecy. As the year 2012 approached, some predicted that the wandering world would return, that old gods would stand again on their platforms, or at least that the sky would misbehave. Astronomers gave interviews with the patience of schoolteachers. There is no rogue planet, they said. If there were, amateurs with small telescopes would have photographed it years in advance. The year came and went with the usual share of storms and elections. The old tablets stayed put in their cases. The fact that these ideas keep returning says something kind about us. People want meaning on a large scale. The Mesopotamians wanted it too. They found it in a council that set fates, a contract between gods and cities, and a map where every gate had a guardian. Modern readers who are not satisfied with human slow work sometimes look for a faster spark. Aliens become a substitute for divine will. Rockets stand in for thrones. The Anunnaki fit easily into that frame because they already carry the weight of origin stories. There is a third path through the modern maze. It sits between debunking and belief. This path treats the ancient texts as human documents that can be read with care, and it allows wonder without surrendering to fantasy. On this path, the flood story tells us about a land that lived with rivers as both gift and threat. The creation of people to carry baskets says something honest about societies that run on organized labor. The descent to the underworld shows how grief is given structure when the dead must be kept close by name and by offering. The Anunnaki on this path are not spacemen. They are the way a city made sense of power, justice, and limits. That does not stop the pop culture borrowings, and perhaps it should not. Fiction lives on what if. A novelist who puts an Anunnaki on a lonely shore and gives him a memory of stars is writing in the same spirit that let a Sumerian sing of a moon god who rides a boat across the night. What matters is that we know which shelf we are on. Myth can be playful and still be true to its source. Pseudoscience pretends to be a manual and then asks to be graded on charm. One persistent aside deserves an answer because it has caused more heat than light. Some writers have connected the Anunnaki with biblical hints about sons of God and giants. It is easy to draw threads across texts if you use only the sound of words. The careful way is to follow the languages and the dates. Ideas do travel. Flood stories surely did. But Mesopotamian gods are not simply rebadged figures in later books. They have their own history. They live in a very specific world of canals, barley, and baked brick. Their stories do not need a later scaffolding to stand. If you walk back to the tablets after a tour through the modern claims, they feel steadier than ever. A scribe in an old Babylonian schoolroom writes that people were made so that the gods would not have to dig. A hymn in Sumerian praises Enlil for setting fates. A list of offerings says that 50 loaves and 10 jugs of beer were given to the high circle at new moon. A boundary stone calls on the Anunnaki to punish a thief of land. None of these lines require a spaceship to make sense. They require a city where everyone knows that work must be shared and that promises must hold. The more you read, the more the modern detours look like a mirror for current hopes and fears. Fear that our knowledge is not enough. Hope that we are part of a wider story. These are fair feelings. The ancients had them too. They answered with temples, calendars, and councils. We answer with telescopes, particle accelerators, and sometimes with mass-market paperbacks that move quickly off the shelf. In both cases, the craving is the same. We want to see the frame. There is no harm in enjoying a television hour where someone points at a relief and says perhaps. There is harm when speculation is sold as translation. The best corrective is not scolding, it is reading. Read an account tablet that lists the rations for a canal crew, and then read the lines in Atrahasis, where the gods decide that people will carry baskets. Read the lament for a fallen city, and stand in front of a burned brick layer in an excavation trench. Read a hymn to Inanna, and walk the plan of Uruk where her temple stood. The old stories will earn your trust without help. In the end, the modern life of the Anunnaki has two branches. In one, they are managers of a universe that runs on decree, offering, and measured time. In the other, they are travelers from a far world who left us a mixed inheritance of freedom and servitude. The first branch is backed by clay and context, the second by wish and rhetoric. Both are now part of cultural memory. Only one needs a glossary. The word Anunnaki was once a scholar's term that lived mostly in footnotes and seminar rooms. Then, something changed. A minor caste of ancient deities walked onto the bright stage of modern culture and found themselves playing every role from cosmic mentor to secret overlord. It did not happen in a single season. It was a steady drift, powered by television, paperbacks, message boards, and the simple fact that old stories travel well when you give them a fresh vehicle. The first stop was television that promised revelations after the next commercial break. Producers learned that a camera loves ruins, especially if you fly past them at sunset and add a drumbeat. A narrator could whisper that the stones hold a secret and then show a tablet covered in wedge marks. Scholars had said for years that those marks recorded hymns, laws, and daily accounts. The new programs asked if they also recorded visitors from the sky. The question was the hook. You did not need an answer to feel the lure. Episodes multiplied. Cities like Uruk and Ur became recurring characters. Ziggurat stood in for launch towers. The word Anunnaki gained a sparkle it had never worn when it was only a line in a hymn. Publishers kept pace. Big paperbacks with glossy inserts promised a key to the oldest mysteries. Dust jackets featured reliefs of kings with wings, cylinder seals enlarged to billboard size, and starfields drifting behind the title. In these pages, the Anunnaki could be wise teachers, stern geneticists, or a dynasty that never really left. Chapters blended real photographs with captions that suggested new meanings. The method was simple. Take a known object, add a provocative gloss, and let the reader do the rest. Museums saw a ripple effect. Visitors came with questions that jumped across millennia in a single breath. A guide might begin with the irrigation of the lower rivers and arrive at a debate about a wandering world beyond Neptune before the group had reached the second case. The internet opened 1,000 side doors. Early forums hosted long threads where people traded translations, drawings, and dreams. Amateur archivists scanned old articles and posted them with comments. Someone would quote a line from a tablet. Someone else would link to a satellite image of a mound in Iraq and ask what lay beneath. Videos stitched together stock footage and started with the words, "What if?" A subculture of explainers emerged, the kind of people who can talk for an hour with an earnest calm that almost convinces. The Anunnaki became a password in these spaces. Use it, and you signaled that you were willing to entertain very large stories about human origins and destinies. Games and fiction joined in. Writers love a ready-made pantheon. The name Anunnaki sounds old and rich even if you cannot place it on a map. Game designers borrowed the mood. A role-playing rulebook might list the Anunnaki as an ancient faction whose relics grant strange powers. A science fiction novel might place a hidden base under a desert ziggurat and imagine a signal that wakes after a long dormancy. Comic artists drew tall figures with horned crowns stepping from a shaft of light while human onlookers shielded their eyes. None of this claimed to be history. It was the kind of play that myth invites when it leaves the classroom. Music and art took their turn. A band named an album for a sky father. A lyricist wove a flood and a lost city into a chorus that crowds could chant. Tattoo artists learned to translate a favorite cuneiform sign into clean lines. Street murals put a winged figure on a brick wall beside a spray-painted planet, as if to say that the most ancient stories still want a say in modern weather. Pop culture is a net that catches what glints. The Anunnaki began to glint. Conventions made the movement social. In hotel ballrooms and community centers, speakers took the stage with slides that moved from excavations to star charts. In the lobby, vendors sold paperbacks, replica seals, and meteorite fragments the size of a thumbnail. In one corner, a retired engineer explained to a teenager how a reed boat might behave on a sudden flood. In another, a podcaster recorded interviews about a possible return date for an object no observatory had tracked. The gathering was part science fair, part revival, and part book club. Most people came for the thrill of an idea that linked the first cities to the far future. Museums adapted. Curators learned to anticipate questions that were not in the wall text. They wrote labels that explained how a scribe held a reed and why a tablet broke the way it did. They added a panel that said what Nibiru means in the late star lists and why scholars do not use it for a hidden planet. Docents practiced clear answers that respected curiosity while pointing back to the evidence in the case. Some exhibitions staged a gentle debate by placing a tablet of the flood beside a map of ancient river channels and a photo of a modern levee. The effect was to show that myth, environment, and memory form a braid rather than a riddle box. Schools also felt the ripple. Teachers found that a lesson on Mesopotamia drew more attention when it acknowledged the pop culture version, and then used that interest to teach how we know what we know. A class might read a short passage from Atrahasis and then try to design a simple boat out of reeds and paper to carry a handful of grain across a tub. Another day, they might examine a boundary stone and write a modern contract that borrows its language. The word Anunnaki becomes a doorway to the real daily world of barley, brick, and debt. The wildest corners of the web offered other performances. Some turned the Anunnaki into a set of masked rulers who pull strings behind elections and bank ledgers. Others fused them with saints, demons, or hidden bloodlines. The pattern is familiar. Take a term that carries age and authority, detach it from context, and let it absorb whatever a moment fears or craves. In this mode, the Anunnaki are a mirror that reflects modern suspicion. When institutions disappoint, a story about unseen hands can feel like an answer, even if it leaves you more anxious than before. Meanwhile, a quieter current has grown. Independent translators post side-by-side renderings of short hymns. Digital projects build searchable corpora that let anyone look up a word in a line from a tablet and see every other place it occurs. Documentary filmmakers spend time with archaeologists in the field and show how a square meter of soil can give up 3 tablets that change how we date a local ruler. In these works, the Anunnaki return to their original roles as a label for the highest council and, later, for the judges below. The drama is still there, but it belongs to a living discipline that can say when a claim fits the clay and when it does not. If there is a reason the Anunnaki have found a permanent niche in popular culture, it is that they answer 2 appetites at once. They offer the romance of the first cities, with their processions, towers, and glittering offerings. They also offer a cosmic script that can be rewritten to taste. You can cast them as guardians, or as tyrants, as teachers, or as creditors. Their very flexibility is what carried the term through ancient centuries as duties shifted from sky to underworld. The same flexibility carries the term through modern media as it moves from a footnote to a headline and back again. The risk is confusion, but there is also a gain. People who would never have thought about Sumer now look up cuneiform and learn the difference between Sumerian and Akkadian. A viewer who arrives for a grand story about lost knowledge may stay long enough to learn why a calendar matters to a farmer, how a canal roster was kept fair, and what it meant to swear by the names of the old High Court. If the cost is that a museum guard has to smile through one more question about a hidden planet, that seems a price worth paying. The path from obscurity to spotlight has left the Anunnaki with a double life. They are still the elders who set destinies in tablets and who sit in judgment below. They are also symbols that modern creators use to signal depth and mystery. The first is anchored in clay and brick and the long memory of a riverland. The second floats in a sea of screens. Both will likely remain, because the old stories are generous hosts and modern culture never stops looking for a stage. If you want to see how a modern society wrestles with ancient stories, go to 3 places in one afternoon. Start in a university seminar room where a professor of Assyriology writes wedge signs on a whiteboard and explains how a single mark can change meaning when it is turned a quarter turn. Walk next to a planetarium where an astronomer shows a sky full of tracked objects and explains why wandering worlds reveal themselves long before they arrive. Finish in a museum conservation lab where a specialist in broken clay coaxes a new line out of a tablet with a brush and a light. Between these rooms, you will watch a myth pass through scrutiny, not to flatten it but to find its proper size. Academic skepticism begins with language. Ancient words are not puzzles to be solved once and for all. They are living items that change context by era and by city. Take Nibiru. In late Babylonian star lists it can name a crossing point in the sky, or a planet that serves as a marker for seasonal order. It is not a separate world trying to hide behind the Sunday. The word Anunnaki behaves in the same way. In Sumerian hymns it names the high circle of gods who set destinies. In first millennium incantations it can name the judges below. Neither usage points to a population of miners from deep space. These facts are not opinions. They are the product of thousands of tablets read in sequence with a habit of asking what a term means in a given text rather than what it might mean in an argument. Philology has a plain grace. A scholar lays out parallel passages and shows that a phrase about mixing clay with God's blood recurs in contexts that discuss cult, birth, and the gift of speech. The point is not to sneer at imaginative readings. It is to show that ancient authors wrote within traditions that we can trace. A line that sits beside a hymn in one tablet and a ritual in another does not suddenly become a lab note when moved to a coffee table book. Good skepticism is careful loyalty to sources. Archaeology adds ground under the words. Excavations at cities like Uruk, Nippur, and Babylon reveal layers of rebuilding, shifts in river courses, and rooms filled with the everyday kit of life. Foundation deposits under new walls carry prayers that ask the old High Court to guard the work. Boundary stones summon the same court to curse anyone who moves a marker. The physical record explains why the gods are so often asked to watch canals and enforce property. It does not hide a hangar or a landing pad. If someone wanted to argue for ships in a marsh, the least they could do is show a bolt or a shard of an alloy the region did not know. None has appeared. Astronomy closes the gate on the grandest of modern claims. The solar system is a neighborhood that has been surveyed by professionals and by hobbyists who do not mind losing sleep. Large bodies announce themselves. They tug on planets we already track. They glow in infrared surveys. Their paths can be simulated on a laptop and compared to what we see through glass. When people predict that a hidden giant will swoop near the Earth, astronomers do not scoff. They measure. When the measurement returns empty, they say so. The wonder of the real sky does not suffer for lack of drama. It offers comets that shed tails like chalk, and planets with moons that eclipse in patterns so crisp you can set a clock to them. Scientists and scholars also keep an eye on the ways ideas spread. Claims about a dangerous object with no coordinates have a pattern. The date shifts when the day passes. The evidence is always one layer removed. The believer says a friend knows someone who worked at a facility that saw something that cannot be shown. In such cases, the calm reply is to invite a look through a telescope, a visit to a public sky survey, and a review of how orbits work. A general audience can learn the essentials of celestial mechanics faster than you might think. Once you understand why a long-period giant would have battered the inner system for eons, you stop expecting it to tiptoe past in a single season. None of this means those old stories are small. The flood tale is not a weather report, but it is a way to remember the truth of living in a delta where a river can shift and drown a generation. The creation of people to carry baskets is not a laboratory scene, but it is as honest about labor and ration as any modern budget. The descent to the underworld does not draw a map, but it gives shape to grief and explains why families poured beer for their dead when the month turned. A myth holds wisdom when it stays where it belongs. You can see the health of a field in how it treats disagreement. Assyriology is surprisingly cheerful about debate. Editors publish new collations that correct old readings. A tablet that once seemed to say one thing shows another when a lost corner turns up. Arguments play out in footnotes with a dry humor that hides real passion for getting a line right. Even the larger conclusions adjust over time. A century ago, scholars wrote about fixed pantheons. Today they speak of divine households that shift by city and by period, which gives you a richer view of why a name like Anunnaki can travel from the sky to the deep. There is also a lesson in humility that comes from the tablets themselves. Clay is fragile, yet it outlives empires. A temple burns, and the heat bakes a library into durability. A flood knocks down a wall and seals a storeroom where a clerk last stacked a set of loans. When we read what he wrote, we are not only learning about gods, we are seeing how human beings in a hard place made systems that lasted. Scribes invented a way to number time that still governs our days. Surveyors set boundary marks that lasted through dynasties. Priests created calendars that moved crowds in step. These achievements stand whether or not anyone ever looked down from another world. The legacy of the Anunnaki in modern life is therefore a double thread. On one strand, the name is a teaching tool. It leads students toward the first cities, the first ledgers, and the first grand attempts to put justice in writing. On the other, the name has become a canvas for new stories that say something about our own anxieties and wishes. Both strands will continue. One stays anchored to clay and careful reading. The other floats and changes color with each decade. It may be that the endurance of the old term depends on that flexibility. A living culture finds uses for an ancient label, even when the original owners might not recognize the part. What matters is that we keep the categories straight. When a museum label tells you that a tablet is a hymn to Enlil recorded in Sumerian and copied in Akkadian, that is, a piece of knowledge hard won. When a late-night host tells you that the same hymn is a veiled description of a machine, that is theater. Enjoy the show, but do not put it in a footnote. The ancient authors deserve that respect. They built a world in words that explained why cities rise and fall, why work must be shared, and why promises bind. They named a high council that fixed destinies, and they later pictured that council as a bench of judges below. That is quite enough grandeur for one tradition. If you want a last test of how myth and science can coexist without quarrel, go back to the planetarium after dark. A guide dims the lights and brings up the sky of a spring night over the lower rivers 4,000 years ago. The constellations look both strange and familiar. The moon rises. A line appears that marks the path of Jupiter as it would have moved that month. The guide quotes an omen that links the bright god to good harvest if a wind blows from a given quarter. Then the guide explains how the planet loops against the background stars because of the dance of our orbits. No one in the room feels cheated. The old line and the new explanation sit together as neatly as an offering bowl inside a brick shrine. The Anunnaki keep their seat in memory. The sky keeps its beauty. We keep our appetite for both. Walk into a quiet room with a single clay tablet on its stand, and you can feel the distance between us and the first cities shrink to nothing. The marks are small and tidy, a list of offerings, a hymn, a king's boast. Somewhere behind it stands a priest who counted loaves at dawn, or a scribe who copied a line until it sounded right. Out of this plain material, the people of the lower rivers built a map of the unseen that they called the work of the Anunnaki. It explained why days had shape and why rulers needed limits. It said that destinies were spoken in a court that stood above human quarrels. It was practical spirituality, and it proved durable. The old stories are not random legends, stacked one on another. They are a joined system. The separation of sky and earth gives the world structure. The council of the high gods sets fates so that kingship and calendar have weight. The creation of people answers a labor problem and justifies a social order where canal, rosters, and temple rations matter. The flood resets the balance when growth outruns the land's patience, then leaves a promise that life will continue within a narrower span. The descent to the realm of the dead teaches that grief can be managed if the living remember the names of their own. Each episode solves a problem that a city faces and turns it into a story that can be repeated at festivals and read in quiet rooms. When we say mythology, we sometimes mean a cloud of fancy. In Mesopotamia, it was also a handbook. The Mi are not ornaments in a poem. They are a catalogue of powers that make a city work, from plows and weaving to truth and kingship. The Anunnaki are not a parade of caprice. They are a council that guarantees that decisions echo across years and not only days. Even the grandest moments carry a Clark sense of what must be tallied. When Inanna carries culture home by boat, she returns with real institutions. When a boundary stone calls on the High Court to curse a thief, it is enforcing a fence line that keeps a harvest safe. This clarity is why Mesopotamian myth traveled so well. Traders carried it upriver. Conquerors repackaged it for their own capitals. Scribes adapted the caste as duties shifted. The Hittites borrowed the idea of elder gods confined below by a younger order. The Babylonians promoted a city god to chief and gave him the task of setting the sky in measurable paths. The Hebrews, who lived within reach of the same rivers, shaped a flood story that kept the bones of an older tale and placed it in a new frame of one god and a covenant. Motifs crossed languages with the ease of a caravan on a good road because the needs they met were the same. Every society must think about work and authority and catastrophe and loss. A modern reader can move between these retellings and watch a new thing happen. Myth becomes a way to compare how cultures answer the same question in different rooms. Why does power belong to some and not to others? Sumer says the office descends from heaven and is ratified in a sacred city. Babylon says a god who rebuilds the world earns the right to rule the rest. Israel says a single creator binds kings to justice and remembers the poor. The argument is centuries long and entirely civil on the page. Each tradition hands down a set of stories and expects citizens to live with the consequences. There is a pleasure in how concrete the Mesopotamian system stays, even at its most cosmic. Ziggurats are not abstract ladders. They are bricks that lift a ritual to a height where a procession can be seen across a city. A calendar is not a metaphysical diagram. It is a schedule for canals, sowing, and harvest that people chant so everyone shows up on time. Omens do not turn people into puppets. They turn attention outward to sky and wind so that decisions are made with care. The Anunnaki sit above, but they never float away from streets where millstones turn and barges nose through a narrow lock. If you ask what gives these myths their staying power, the answer is that they keep their feet on the ground while their eyes are on the horizon. They admit that the world is perilous and that the best you can do is share burdens and keep your promises in the sight of witnesses who will outlast you. They give a name to fate but leave room for argument and mercy in the figure of a god who looks for humane paths when rules chafe. They praise order but do not pretend that order is free. Someone must clean the silt from a canal. Someone must sing a lament when a city falls. The stories do not excuse those tasks. They honor them. They also acknowledge limits without despair. Mortality arrives after the flood, not as a curse only, but as a boundary that makes society bearable. The afterlife is no prize, yet the living can comfort the dead with regular attention. Kings may boast, but every tablet that records a grant also calls on the highest court to punish future fraud, which is a quiet confession that power needs breaks. A tradition that says such things is not just old, it is mature. When the Anunnaki step into modern imagination as aliens or secret patrons, we are watching a familiar human move. We take an elder symbol for order and fit it to fresh anxieties. Sometimes that is playful and generous. Sometimes it is a shortcut that mistakes wonder for evidence. Either way, the term endures because it remains a useful vessel for awe. A writer can put it in a sentence, and readers will sense that something large is at stake, even if they cannot say why. The better use is to let the old idea do the job it was built for. Treat Anunnaki as the name for the High Council in a world that believed the universe runs on rules that cities must honor. Read a hymn to Enlil, and then look at the plan of Nippur where petitions were brought. Read the flood story, and then look at the silt band in a trench at Ur. Read a boundary curse, and then walk along a modern levee and feel in your body why a line matters. The myths are not there to escape reality. They are there to bind reality together with clear language and shared memory. There is one last way in which these stories are modern. They encourage a habit of transparency. Decisions must be spoken in public. Oaths must name witnesses, divine and human. Rituals should be regular and visible. You could almost say that the invention of accountability begins here, in the insistence that a fate is not a whim, but a decree that can be heard and weighed. When later cultures adopt written law and public festival, they are building on ground that the first cities stamped with wedges. So when you stand in that quiet room and the tablet on the stand still looks small, remember what it contains. A belief that time is countable, a conviction that work is a shared trust, a fear of flood and famine, offset by a stubborn faith that order can return if cities rebuild and gods forgive, and a name for a council that guarantees that words have weight. The Anunnaki survive not because they are glamorous, but because the world still needs what they represent. If you strip the gold from the funerary masks, roll up the painted wall reliefs, and set aside the grand names, what remains is a set of worries and hopes that look very familiar. Rain in season, children who live, work that counts, a fair hearing when trouble comes. The Anunnaki myth cycle is a long conversation about those things. It is a human story that tried to make the unpredictable seem bearable and the ordinary feel worthy of ceremony. Start with work. The earliest poems never pretend that labor is noble because it is easy. They say directly that irrigation is hard and that someone must carry baskets. They then give that burden a frame. If people were made to take up the tasks that gods could not stomach forever, then toil is not a failure of planning. It is a founding choice. That sounds stern until you see the comfort it offers. The farmer on a levee at noon can imagine himself inside a plan that begins before memory. The temple ration list is not only bookkeeping, it is participation in the same compact that the first gods sealed with clay and blood. Meaning arrives in a bowl of beer counted out by a clerk who knows your name. Move to law. The habit of swearing oaths by the High Court makes justice more than whim. When a scribe writes a boundary grant and calls the Anunnaki to witness, he is trying to tie a local quarrel to the oldest authority in the world. He is also protecting future strangers. A tablet buried under a marker stone speaks for anyone who is not yet born, so that a field remains a field when memories have thinned. This is a small miracle of foresight. It is the beginning of a tradition that says the dead and the unborn, both, have claims that the living must respect. Consider grief. The Mesopotamian afterlife is dim and spare, yet the living refuse to let it be lonely. They pour beer for their dead, bring bread, and speak names aloud so that the shades will feel remembered. The Anunnaki, as judges below, are not only frightening, they are a guarantee that stories do not end in a ditch. A life is weighed, a wrong can still be marked, and a right can still count. When a family keeps the month right, they are not trying to buy favor. They are insisting the connection endures across the river. In a world without antibiotics or rescue helicopters, that insistence is a humane triumph. Think about power. Kings march through the texts with more ceremony than most of us can stomach, but beneath the parade sits a rule that cuts them down to size. Kingship is alone. It descends. It can be revoked. If a ruler fails, poets will say that the city god walked out of the temple, which is a polite way of saying that legitimacy has left the building. The Anunnaki in their bright court are the board that can say enough. You can call this mythology, but you can also call it the birth of constitutional thought, written in clay instead of parchment. Now watch how the stories train attention. Omens lead people to look up and outward, not to freeze in fear, but to gather more information before acting. A moon ring and a wind from the west mean that it is not a good week to pick a fight in the hills. An odd birth in a cow herd warns of strain in the year ahead, so strengthen the canal banks. Today, we call this risk management. The Anunnaki frame turns habit into policy by claiming that the universe sends consistent signals and that careful people can read them. The method is often wrong by modern standards, but the posture is admirable. It says that decisions should be informed, not impulsive. We can also see a steady tenderness for craft. Enki is the patron of clever hands. Ninhursag is the patron of life that is well made. The Mi include weaving, carpentry, music, and brewing. These are not frills. They are ranked with truth and victory because they keep a city alive and make it worth living in. A boat builder who knows how to caulk a seam is an agent of divine order. A singer who remembers the right lament keeps a community honest about loss. When the Anunnaki bless a project, they are blessing skills as much as outcomes. There is a lesson about limits that feels bracing rather than bleak. After the flood, the span of human life is shortened, not to punish, but to prevent the world from choking on success. This is ecological thinking before the word existed. The council chooses a ceiling so that the system can persist. Modern readers hear an echo of ration books and water tables. The ancients heard a boundary that restored sleep to gods and rest to the earth. Either way, the idea is the same. Enough is a virtue. Too much can break the very thing you love. The myths also refuse to make virtue simple. Enlil stands for authority and sometimes swings too hard. Enki stands for mercy and sometimes bends rules to save lives. Inanna stands for desire and ambition, which can build cities and start wars. Utu stands for justice and is asked to read hearts as well as tablets. These portraits are unflinching. No god is a cartoon. No impulse is pure. A reader learns to value, balance, and to mistrust any single quality that claims to rule alone. Bring the camera closer, and you can see daily scenes that the stories sanctify without fuss. A brewer skims foam in a courtyard and tips the first cup on the ground for the god. A canal crew breaks in the shade to eat dates and flatbread, then returns to lift baskets in a chain that runs like a drumbeat. A shepherd calls his flock from a levee, as a scribe waits with a stylus to tally the count. A midwife dips a cloth in cool water, while a family murmurs a hymn to the mother of all living. When the High Council blesses the city, it is these tasks that grow easier for a season. Myth gives them a frame and a thank you. Even war is brought within rules. Before a campaign, kings consult omens and priests. They make offerings and swear that they will spare certain sanctuaries. When the season ends, they hang up weapons and mark a festival that mends civic life. The Anunnaki do not ban violence, they domesticate it. They require that power answer to expectation. If that sounds naive, remember how many modern states still need rituals to shepherd troops home and to reknit a city after strain. The human story also includes a taste for second chances. The flood ends with regret and a new plan rather than a boast. Inanna returns from the underworld through a negotiated substitution that keeps the rules while letting life resume. Even curses on boundary stones include a line that says the gods will bless anyone who restores what was broken. Mercy threads through the hard talk because people cannot live on law alone. It is easy to think that belief in a council of gods belongs to a distant past. Then, you notice how much of our life still echoes the older pattern. Companies and courts sit in rooms and decree outcomes that shape years for thousands. We build calendars that tell us when to plant, when to pay, when to gather, and when to rest. We keep ledgers and expect strangers to honor them. We pour drinks for absent friends and speak names at graves. We hope that someone beyond the room keeps a record of what was fair and what was mean. The labels have changed, the habits have not. What the Anunnaki offer in the end is not a set of exotic images, but a way to match human scale to cosmic scale. They make it possible to say that a loaf offered in a side chapel and the path of Jupiter across the month both belong to the same order. They make it possible to believe that a law carved in stone and a prayer whispered at night both carry weight because both are answered in places that outlast any one life. That belief steadied people who lived with fickle rivers and capricious kings. It can steady us as well if we translate the terms with care. So the human story behind the Anunnaki is not really about gods. It is about the choice to live as if words matter, as if work is holy when shared, as if limits are a gift, and as if memory binds the living and the dead. The first cities pinned those choices to clay. The tablets are small, but they keep speaking. If you want to test whether the Anunnaki are only words, take a map and go where their names first made sense. The story lives in places, It breathes in the shape of riverbeds and the smell of baked brick after rain. A myth that began as talk in temples still has addresses. Start at Eridu, far to the south where the ancient shoreline once lapped against low ground. Here the Sumerians said Enki kept house at the meeting of sweet water and salt. Archaeologists found a stack of temples, one built over another like chapters placed on a shelf. Each layer carried an altar and a plan that grew a little more ambitious than the one beneath it. Stand there, and you understand why a god of wisdom would live at a margin between worlds. The sound of reeds in a breeze is a quiet lesson in beginnings. Move north to Ur. The ziggurat rises from the plain with the stubborn pride of a survivor. Woolley cleared its stairways and found the royal cemetery nearby, where gold, lapis, and carnelian lay with lyres and carts in a pageant of farewell. You can trace the route of a funeral party in your head. Musicians led. Attendants followed. A queen descended to a chamber furnished as if for an evening that would never end. The logic was clear. The underworld needs civility too. When hymns speak of judges below, they do so in a culture that packed a lamp and a cup for the road. Uruk still sprawls like a small country. It once held districts for Inanna and An, with platforms and halls that could hold crowds whose voices would roll like surf across sunlit brick. Uruk gave us writing, and the first argument about what a city is for. Walk its mounds, and you can almost hear the clicks of styluses and the creak of loaded carts in lanes lined by mud walls. When a tale says that Inanna sailed home with the gifts of culture, Uruk is the city she made worthy of the cargo. Nippur looks modest from a distance, a tangle of mounded earth with baked brick peeking through, but this was the seat of Enlil and the place where kings sought the right to rule. The Kur precinct gives the idea of a cosmic council a floor plan. Courts, storerooms, stairways, and altars are pieces of a working campus where petitions rose, with incense and clay tablets moved like memos between rooms. The thought that the Anunnaki decreed destinies makes sense when you pace the remains of a complex built to turn vows and offerings into outcomes. Lagash lies in the flatlands like a book left open. Here the first legal reforms were carved by a ruler who wanted to curb abuses and defend the weak. Texts from this city have the bite of minutes taken at a tense meeting. They speak of fishing rights in canals, of rations, and of officials who had learned to take too much. The gods of a high council mattered here because someone had to hold the line when the strong leaned hard on the rest. Kish was a northern sentinel. The king list gives it the honor of rule after the flood. Its tells still keep the earth color of long years of Sunday. Armies passed up and down past these fields on their way to quarrels that we know only from terse entries. A city that watches a frontier learns to love documents. It also learns which gods to call when you must insist that a promise endure when a throne falls. Shuruppak gives a different sort of chill. This is the city that later storytellers named as the home of the flood hero. Excavations exposed a band of river clay that suggests a catastrophic inundation in the early 3rd millennium. Not the end of the world, but the end of a generation's plans. Read the flood tale after you handle that earth, and it becomes plausible in a new way. A council that decides to reset the world sounds like a poet's answer to a city racing to rebuild. Across the Tigris stands Ashur, a city that would give its name to an empire. Its god, also called Ashur, took up roles once filled by older southern powers. Palaces rose along the river with courtyards where kings displayed reliefs of hunts and battles in long, cool corridors. Their scribes kept omen lists and rituals, because even a state that wins often wants a sense that victories and defeats are more than luck. Here the old title Anunnaki still appears, now as part of a wider ledger that includes the fortunes of campaigns and the seating arrangements of conquered gods. On a bend of the Euphrates lay Mari, a river hub where palaces held hundreds of rooms and archives bulged with letters. The tablets there record kings sending messengers with gifts and threats, governors complaining about barley shortfalls, and priests reporting omens from sky and sheep. The Anunnaki enter these lines as witnesses, a shared language of authority that let one city understand another's oath. A myth becomes policy when it is useful in a letter that must move men and grain. Nineveh and nearby Nimrud take you into the rooms of Ashurbanipal. His library hoarded knowledge with a zeal that still startles. It kept the Epic of Gilgamesh and the rituals that named the gods in the right order so that a plea would find its target. In these shelves, the Anunnaki survived the fall of the cities that first named them. The kings who carved lions kept the songs of older priests because the words still worked. Then there is Babylon, a city that insisted on being the center of whatever world it belonged to. Its processional way ran between walls faced with glazed brick in the color of deep sky. The Ishtar Gate wore dragons and bulls that announced serious business within. In the temple quarter, the New Year rites bound calendar to kingship and placed Marduk at the head of a pantheon that still remembered the older family. When lists divide the Anunnaki into those of heaven and those of earth, that neat arithmetic fits a city that liked tallies, schedules, and measured glory. The story is not only in the ground. It lives in cases and drawers. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad holds riches that tell the whole arc, from prehistoric pottery to the tablets that name the high gods. The British Museum houses the flood tablet that made a young reader jump from his chair. The Louvre keeps kings in stone, who still stare like men who intend to be obeyed. Berlin's museums hold a gate that glitters even in modern light. Each gallery is a stop on the same river of objects that began as offerings and records, and ended as ambassadors. What you notice, as you connect these points, is how thoroughly the ideas cling to geography. A god of sweet waters belongs at Eridu because the plain needs fresh water to live. A council that sets destinies belongs at Nippur because every city sent prayers there. Judges of the underworld fit a society that buried its dead with lamps and spoke month rites at graves. The Anunnaki are not floating abstractions. They are titles that took shape where real people dug, counted, swore, and hoped. Methods matter in this map. Archaeologists trowel layer by layer and log, each find with the care of a clerk, because objects without context can lie. A tablet found in a trash pit near a temple kitchen can teach more about offerings than a tablet found in a dealer's case. Survey teams track canal lines visible from the air and then walk them on foot to see which bends still hold moisture in a spring month. Specialists test bricks for salt to guess why a quarter of a city failed. Out of such patient work comes a better sense of why the people who named the Anunnaki made the choices they did. There is also the living land. Marshes returned in the south after years of loss, and with them returned the look of a world that knew reed boats and water buffalo in channels bright with dragonflies. Farmers still coax grain from soil that shines with salt when you walk at noon. Pilgrims and guards still stand on ziggurat steps and watch wind push dust along the horizon. A story that began 5,000 years ago can still borrow details from an afternoon's walk. When you lay the map on a table and place a finger on each city, the old narrative falls into place without effort. This is the family of the sky born out of the plain. This is the council that speaks in a temple where a king asks for a year of favor. This is the court below where judges listen to names read in a ritual voice. The Anunnaki are the spine that holds the map together. Follow that spine, and you can travel from a first shrine on a sandspit to a library where a schoolboy learned to copy a floodline. Stand back from the tablets and ruins, and you see a simple pattern. The Anunnaki were the grammar of a civilization that needed order in a land of restless water. Cities named patrons, set calendars, swore oaths, and trusted that a high court would hear. When empires rose, the council was reorganized. When empires fell, the names survived in libraries that outlived their walls. Modern readers borrowed the term for new tales, but the core remained the same. It is a promise that work, law, memory, and fate can be spoken clearly and kept. The story ends where it began, on the plain. A ziggurat step warmed by Sunday, a canal bend furred with reeds, a tablet that still carries a thumbprint. The voices behind them are gone, yet the system they built can still be read. It tells us to count carefully, to share burdens, to respect boundaries, and to leave room for mercy. That is not a distant theology. It is a manual for living together.